Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. I am Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And with me today are Murray Dahm, the assistant editor, Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, and Lindsay Powell. And today we are discussing issue 17.5, volume 17, issue 5, the last time that we'll refer to an issue of the magazine as that because that's the 99th Ancient Warfare. And as the next issue, we're just going to I think I've explained this before to, a numbering system that most people will understand without having to think about it and us not having to print X, V, I. Well, actually, that would be issue 101. Never mind. Issue 17.5 deals with a legion. We thought we'd just have as a theme the history of one single legion. And of course, there's plenty of legions to choose from in the Principate. Some histories would be extremely short. There's a few very short-lived ones. There's a few that would be very long and would not fit in a single issue, probably. Macedonica?
Yeah, five Macedonica would probably extend into medieval as well.
Yeah, it goes a really, really long time. We just went for somewhere in the middle with Legio Decima Fretensis. And looking at the issue, at the articles we had, I think maybe today we want to pay a little more attention to the very early history of the Legion because that was covered by Lindsay's introduction. I'm sure we can talk some more about that because it's an interesting period, and when we're talking about it, we don't have to worry about illustrations, which makes it harder to write about it in the magazine. And perhaps the first question should be: does this Legion, as has been claimed, have any relation to the famous 10th Equestris of Caesar's fame?
Well, here's the thing. I don't know that really you can be very emphatic about that point. I mean, in the research I did, they came out Fretensis sort of starts in the 40s BC, we think. We don't have, for example, an inscription that says it was founded on this day in this place. So you do it by inference and supposition. And the fact that it has fret typically, or frete as typically is the cognomen, tells you it's different than the other 10, which is the one that's famous and documented in the texts of the commentaries of the Gallic War and everywhere else. So, I mean, the early origins of these legions is typically a combination of guesswork and inference, and this is more likely than not.
I would say that you're following Theodore Mommsen, who, of course, made the grand announcement that this was not Caesar's 10th Legion, that he believed that the 10th Legion, Fretensis, was actually, as has already been said by Lindsay, the Legion of the Straits, and therefore coming from the conflict between Sextus Pompeius and Augustus, or Octavian as he was at that point, and Agrippa, and that sort of dates to the 30s, in which, in 36, I should be saying, in which you've got conflict down in Sicily in the Straits and being referenced are the Straits of Messina. There's only one little problem in that all the information about that conflict coming from Appian, coming from Valerius Paterculus, never mentions any legions in terms of by name or designation. It refers to numbers of legions doing this and doing that. And it also has a little problem in terms of if you're saying that the 10th Legion earns its name there as an extra legion that's been raised by Octavian, perhaps. The only problem there is that there's no conflict at the Straits as such. The two sea battles take place off the coast of Sicily, nowhere near the Straits of Messina. There is no conflict in terms of crossing those straits during this conflict. So why would they be named after the straits in that sense?
Most of the naming isn't about a war, is it? None of the legions are named after a battle.
Some of it's about origins. Like where it's, take Legion of the Ninth being raised in Spain. You've got others, prospectively, the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix. There's an argument that was a title gained during one of the rebellions in Britannia, possibly the Iceni Rebellion. Sometimes it's a cognomen that's coming from a reference to a leader of some description. So you've got an Augusta Legion, you've got who supposedly are the Loyal Legion, the Second Legion to Augustus in the Civil Wars. So there's different reasons for why the names are given. But coming back to names, it was already mentioned that there's a 10th Equestris running around at some point. Now, no point does Caesar actually... the reference to the 10th Legion being called Equestrian comes from 58 BC, when Caesar is going to meet Ariovistus, I think it is, and there's an agreement between them that in their discussions they can only be accompanied by their bodyguard, and so therefore he decides that he's not trusting his bodyguard of Gallic cavalry at the time, so therefore, or Germanic cavalry, sorry. So therefore he takes the Germanic cavalry off their horses, puts the 10th Legion on the horses, and takes them to the meeting instead because he feels more secure. And afterwards, there's a comment made that is recorded, one of the legionaries saying, he's given us what he promised and more. He's not just enrolled us in the Legion, but he's even made us equestrians, being a joke on the word. But that Legion never actually takes up that title. At that point, Caesar never talks about them as that title. The title, the 10th Equestrian, only comes only comes later on in some inscriptions in Italy. So again, is that Caesar's 10th Legion? Not necessarily. There is one prospect of the 10th Legion being Fretensis being Caesar's 10th Legion. And that is that when you get to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, of course, there is another strait where the 10th Legion could be involved. And that's when they're actually crossing from Brundisium across to Greece in order for Caesar to take on Pompey's forces in Greece. Caesar gets to the crossing point. He takes his legions. He takes, 12 legions with him down to Brundisium. When he gets there, he realizes he's only got shipping for a limited number of his forces, so therefore he takes 7 legions across from Brundisium to Greece. At that point, he leaves 5 behind, and this is where we find that they're being put under the charge of Marcus Antonius. And he is left there. Now, Caesar gets across, makes the crossing with his 7 legions, avoids the fleets that are being commanded by Pompey and his legions, but once Caesar is across, he sends the shipping back, at which point you've got Marcus Bibulus, who, in charge of some of Pompey's fleet, actually takes out a lot of the transport ships. I think he takes out 30 ships in terms of that fleet returning to receive more of legions of Caesar to cross again. That means that Antonius and his 5 legions are stuck in Brundisium, and at which point you also get Scribonius Libo, who actually goes to besiege Brundisium to make sure that those 5 legions can't leave and they can't get reinforcements in terms of more shipping going in to take them across the straits. And when we're talking about straits here, we're talking about the Straits of Otranto, I think it is. So therefore, you've got Caesar's over in Greece already. He's going off on his campaign's already starting. You've got 5 legions waiting to make the crossing. But then what happens is that the 5 legions, which are made up, we're told, of, I think Appian tells us this, that there are 3 veteran legions and 2 newly recruited legions. The veteran legions, it doesn't state who they are, but there has been recent unrest in the legions, and with legions in particular, 9, 10, I think it's 7, who have caused problems up until then, and will continue causing problems in terms of mini revolts over pay disputes, etc. So therefore, those legions left behind, the 10th could possibly be one of those legions. What happens next is with Scribonius, he tries to besiege them in that harbour, knowing that they haven't got much in terms of shipping. Antonius ends up having 2, maybe they're partially constructed. It says that he builds, although building them from scratch, I don't know, 2 triremes he's got along with that, he's got about 60 small vessels, small support boats that they're being described as. He therefore puts 2 triremes out with half-decent crews that he's got, but he then loads them up with the legionaries and hides them on board. So he sends them out as if they're going out for either reconnaissance or training to get them prepared for some sort of crossing. Scribonius is at an island out front of the harbour at Brundisium, and of course, when he sees these 2 triremes come out, he sends 5 of his own quinremes, I think it is, to deal with them. And of course, once these 5 quinremes head towards these triremes turn around and start scuttling back into the harbour, but supposedly. Although, as the quinremes gain on them, when they've given them enough time to sort of really commit themselves to the attack, the triremes turn around, go on the offensive, and also you get 60 little boats coming out of the harbour and all from all directions, Appian says, and attacking these 5 quinremes. At that point, you've got 1 quinreme is attacked, captured. The remaining 4 are damaged and sent scuttling back to their base where Scribonius is. This is a victory because it ends up meaning that Scribonius, who had at the time, he's also suffering from a lack of supplies and lack of water, he decides it's not worth it keeping an eye on this little enclave of Sasanian forces, and he therefore decides to leave that siege and actually go back over onto the eastern side of the Adriatic and join the rest of Pompey's fleets over there, which basically means that from that point on, the legions are left alone to start to regather and recollect other shipping, which in the preceding months, I think it takes about 7 months before they end up then traveling over and actually joining Caesar in Greece. So if that is the 10th Legion, that would possibly be an explanation of where Fretensis comes from, in which case it is Caesar's Legion.
It would need to be an amalgamation. It couldn't be the pre-existing 10th Legion because it wouldn't have that name.
But the 10th, but before this time, they don't really have names as such. It's only in the time of Augustus that you're starting to really get permanent names being given.
Well, I mean, the problem with a lot of the epithets is they alter. We get different epithets at different points in time.
There is the one bit of support here is that the 10th Legion, also, Fretensis, uses as its symbol 4 different items, doesn't it? It has the ship. It also has a bull. It has a pig, not a boar, but a pig. And it also has, I'm missing one here.
Venus or something, isn't it? Something like that?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. Venus, because it's something like that. My point would be with the bull, there is a suggestion that the 10th Legion of Caesar was a legion that he originally raised in Spain when he was there as pro-praetor in the 50s, but in the 60s BC. So therefore, if we're thinking that the 10th Fretensis has a bull and a ship, maybe that's where that identity is sort of continuing on from Caesar's Legion through to Fretensis.
No, it's the bull. The bull is holy to Venus. That's what it is.
There was a 10th Gemina Legion, which apparently was an amalgamation of another or 2 10th Legions. And is that part of the confusion of where these 10th Legions come from?
That's coming afterwards. That's the 10th Legion Gemina really is that it gains the name after the civil war between Antony and Octavian.
Yes, after 31. It's probably worth mentioning that it's almost impossible to keep track of all the legions between 50 and 30 because there's about I think by the end of the Civil War, assuming that all the legions of Mark Antony go to Octavian, there's somewhere between 40 and 60 legions. There's definitely there's an inscription of a 30th legion, and it's not the one of Trajan's time.
I think it's also interesting that when Caesar crosses to Dyrrachium, he's got 20,000 men, which is 7 legions. You're like, hang on a minute, that's not 20,000 men. That's way under strength. So the idea that those 5 are full is possibly not true too. So they could actually be an amalgamation. But it's odd that you get that when you do get the names of the legions, they do change over time. So they're called one thing and then they get called something else, and then they keep adding other epithets, some of which are the ones we use, but they're not the ones, we don't use Pia Fidelis, for instance, we use Italica. And I think the only foundation inscriptions we have are for 1 and 2 AW330 in the 68 and 69. I think those are the only ones we actually have the foundation diploma.
But it is interesting in terms of Appian using that he's labeling them in terms of veteran legions. That's what I sort of find interesting, that maybe even though we can't necessarily trace them as such, maybe there's something coming through in our sources that are indicating that these are a sort of way of tracing them.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting because the trireme, I think, as one of the emblems of the legion, is also one of the things that Mark Antony uses on nearly all of his coins. So that idea of that means that could also be used, that Antony uses triremes. Therefore, when the legion uses triremes, it's a link to Antony. But there's also that idea that they don't claim them later. You would think that if it was Caesar's 10th in some way, later there would be some reference to them claiming that heritage, and they don't. And it's a very peculiar existence.
But again, we're sort of looking at it over a very long period of time. And I think some of the sources, when you start saying, well, why aren't they continuing this name? We've got gaps in our sources going 30, 40, 50 years. And over that time, the identity of a legion as seen by its members, as seen by the soldiers, and be the veterans or the new recruits, that's going to change as well.
And then there are others where it doesn't. You get legions that keep up their name, Hispana. It's like, there's not a Spaniard in it. Like, yeah, but we're still Critica. We're still, we're still from there. You're like, no, you're not. You're not even descendants of the people from there. You're just in that legion. So that idea of the recruitment origin of a lot of the legions whose names there, and some of the others which are named after the emperor who founded them. 7 Claudia never dumps the name Claudius. It's like, oh, he wasn't very good. Oh no, he's getting poo-pooed in all the sources now. Well, let's find a new name for us. And yet at the same time, you do get legions that do find new names for themselves, which is very unusual.
And legions that we, even at a really ridiculous time, we don't know their actual name. Like I mentioned the 20th before, that Valeria Victrix name seems to come in 50s, 60s, 70s AD. We've got no idea what they were called beforehand.
Well, there are some who would argue on that one that in fact it was Valeria, which then goes back to, for example, the Battonian War 6 to 9, and the Victrix is a separate thing. So sometimes you can actually, just like Murray was talking about, you can have one plus the Pia Fidelis. In fact, it's like 2 separate events. Hispana goes back to the Cantabrian Asturian War, for example.
Which is a clue for later in Roman history when they create the province within Britain of one of the 5 of Valeria, which is one of these confusing late Roman provinces that no one knows where it was. You're like, well, that might be a clue.
Well, so we didn't solve that.
No, but I think it's one of those. It's one of those we don't knows, but it's also, there's an amalgamation of all that information that we can know ish, but not necessarily know anything.
Yeah, it's one of the frustrating parts of Roman or military history in general, is that things that we would really crave to know, I mean, they're kind of beyond the point of being known now.
It's also interesting in terms of hearing somebody like Theodore Mommsen, who is believed, he basically put it out there back 100 years ago about the 10th Fretensis is not Caesar's legion. And for so long, without actually thinking about, what evidence there was, scholar after scholar just accepting it point blank because with his weight, Mommsen must be right.
But the thing is that those sorts of scholars do have that kind of weight, that if you find, if you're disagreeing with, in my personal experience, disagreeing with Syme is, people can always criticize you. If you're like, well, Syme doesn't think so. And you're like, well, yeah, but I'm disagreeing with Syme. We're like, well, yeah, I'm not going to side with you over Ronald Syme. Syme's correct. Like, but and even when there's been information discovered since, or new inscriptions which give nuance to an idea, you'll find people quoting old-fashioned scholarship. And I think one of the problems with before we were on air, we were talking about it, that a lot of the electronic scholarship is the 1911 Britannica being requoted. And that obviously is Mommsen, and in our world, it's often it's very good information, but there's been a century and 10 years of more discovery and scholarship since then. So that idea of, and often I think the referencing system in those electronic and internet sources isn't the best. It doesn't tell you where it comes from. It tells you where the person who wrote it read it in some fourth generation source, but not the original. This is where it comes from. And I think that's one of the things. But again, one of the amazing things about that old scholarship, it's often very sound. And you can go back through it and go, yep, completely right. Even with a century of new discoveries, what they thought happened. Like, that's amazing. There's one passage in Syme's Tacitus where he goes, we're going to discover an inscription which says what I say. And he dies in 1982, and in 2004, they find exactly that inscription that said what he said was going to say. And you're like, that's annoying. But if I was to do that, if I was to write, they're going to find an inscription in 20 years after my death that proves my point, you're not going to get away with that sort of thing.
Only if you bury it first, yeah.
That sort of authority that Syme, and that, I would say confidence if I'm being pro, and I would say arrogance if I'm being anti, to say that. And in print, in Oxford University Press, you're like, you shouldn't be allowed to get away with that. Not even if you're Ronald Syme. But they did, and they were proved right, which is a really annoying prospect.
Yeah. Well, one thing against the good point that Mark just brought up about it being the Strait, between the Strait of Otranto, is that Fretum, which is strait in Latin. I was just looking at it in Little Scott, if it's not specified, it is the Strait of Messina. So that's probably the strait is that one, because I don't think I remembered it. I don't know if that the Strait of Otranto was a thing in ancient times as named as something.
Well, my article in the issue was all about the fact that there's the 10th Fretensis way in the future in the 4th century AD, and you're like, what's this legion? We've never heard of the 10th Fretensis before. Is it the 10th Fretensis?
Could we be consistent, please?
Different name? Is it a misspelling in the manuscript, which some people think it is? Is it a different epithet that they've changed at some point in the 4th century to be called the Strong rather than the Strait?
They've hung out in the middle of the desert for a long time. The straits. I don't see any strait. I don't see any water here.
Yeah, exactly. We're still flying our ship on our Vexillum. You're like, what's that? We're a landlocked desert country. What's that strange thing?
Yeah. Would Augustus have been reluctant to take back the 10th legion that had been in service to Caesar, and then had been service to Mark Antony during the civil war that ensued into his own service and made it an imperial legion?
Well, in 44, 43, doesn't he go down to Capua and with Agrippa and actually with the chest of money and said, you're the veterans of the 10th, I need you on side. And that's what they did. They're his first legion, effectively, the 10th.
I think if it was a Caesarian legion, much less problem for Augustus to take it over. If it's an Antonian legion, issues and loyalties need to be declared, or amalgamations occur. So I think that's where that...
There's also a mention later on of a previous stint of command by Antonius over the 10th. But before they actually arrive in the east and he's using them, there's no other period in their history where they could have been, if they're Caesar's legion, or any legion, where they've been under his command. So for there to be a 10th legion that he has previously commanded, this potentially is one of the limited possibilities.
The other thing, of course, about it being dispatched to the east and kept there for most of its active service is that idea of removing it from its previous connotations. And even though the 10th, the 5th, the 10th, and the 15th are the three that seem to get Vexillations going wherever Vexillations are needed. So, even though the 10th is in the east, and the 5th is in Egypt, what you find is they're the ones that are taken to Dacian wars by Trajan and Domitian. they're the ones taken to the Sarmatian Wars by Marcus Aurelius. And, in 69, it's 5, 10, and 15 that are marched by Mucianus from Judea to Italy.
Well, that makes sense because that's the army that Vespasian has at the time. I mean,
he's got 5 legions, and Mucianus. So there's one of the things, of course, is Mucianus has got more men than Vespasian has. Mucianus, as the governor of Syria, has 4 legions. Vespasian, as the commander of the army in Judea, has 3, but they're on active duty, whereas the 4 legions of Mucianus are just sitting around. So one of the amazing things about Mucianus is to go, I'm in your camp, rather than, no, you should be in my camp. It should be Emperor Mucianus. He doesn't do that. He backs Vespasian and then, dispatches those 3 legions. So there's still 4 other legions that could have had Vexillations dispatched, and they aren't, which is interesting. The idea that those legions, despite being in the east, are often pulled back for campaigns in Dacia and Sarmatia and wherever needed is really, why them? Why is it those legions that get Vexillations selected from them almost more than any other?
In the epigraphic evidence, they also don't seem to be lacking in terms of a career prospect for anybody coming through the 10th Legion. It's I think that was demonstrated in the magazine, that it really sends potential leaders to positions like the Praetorian Guard or the Vigiles back in Rome, or ending up in the treasury. It's not exactly a dead end for your military career or political career.
That was something I came across, was that there's this centurion who has an inscription from Carlisle, and talks about his career in the 10th. And you're like, okay, so Carlisle on, the northern border of Roman Britain. And then you've got the other inscription, which is in modern day Georgia, of the 10th Legion. You're like, that's a big span.
The country of Georgia in the Caucasus. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've alluded to this, though, in other podcasts, haven't we? Where the sheer mobility. We talked about centurions being people that seem to move around at pace and speed. But when I researched that article, other than the basic melees, everybody who was an equestrian, everybody from the senatorial order, was basically shipped thither and yon, just clocking up 2 years here, 3 years here, back into politics, back out into the army. And it's extraordinary. How the heck do you keep track of all of these things? And in fact, what you think about is after Augustus, it's basically the emperor is making the choices of who's going to be the legatus legionis, who is going to be in charge of the prefects at each of these auxiliary units. It's quite an HR undertaking when you think about it.
But this is related to something that we talked about before. I think there is, as far as we know, no general staff. But you'd assume that there's some kind of or a central organization that's doing that, what Lindsay just said, but also making decisions like Murray just alluded to. Presumably it's an estimate of, okay, this legion needs to stay there at full strength because we're worried about those people in the dark woods in Germania, but the Parthians are quiet right now, so let's take some people there. But you might think maybe, on the other hand, you think maybe in North Africa, 3 Augusta, they don't have very much to do. On the other hand, it's just one of them, and they're guarding an enormous stretch of that frontier there.
But it's also, that's sort of that's macro picture. But then it's like this guy, this named person. We're gonna put him as the legatus legionis of that legion. Now this guy, he's going to be the propraetor of that. And you're like, so there's big picture stuff, but all the way down to appointing the legati of individual legions. There's a meeting in Berytus in 69 before Mucianus and Domitian march to Italy to secure the throne for Vespasian, which is done before they arrive. And they have every political office sorted out so that when they take over, they can appoint all of the urban praetors for the new year, because Tetius Julianus is not given that role because he was meant to get it. It's in Tacitus book 4 that he's like, no, we think you're disloyal. You're not getting that position. We're giving it to someone else. Tetius Julianus then proves that he was loyal and is given it later. So you're like, hang on. So you had every single political office that was coming up in 70 assigned if you win. So presumably, therefore, Vitellius has every single political office assigned if I continue to, be emperor. So you're like that's a lot of names. That's a lot of like I'm in line.
You're onto something there, and I wonder what you're seeing is effectively the Roman class system at work with all of the patron-client relationships and the family relationships. And hey, you take my daughter as your wife and marry cousins and things off. And it's all about this really interesting fabric socially, and then it expresses itself politically, so that individuals who are in a position of power do automatically have these networks. And it's obvious what you're going to do. You're going to put your friends and your family in places so that you can bolster up your support. Well, I just finished the biography on Tiberius. And what's very interesting is how he effectively puts the kibosh on some of the things that Augustus had done. Augustus was always about changing his legates at the provincial level, the Legatio Augusti Pro Praetore, every 3 years, right? So they'd rotate 3 years. The proconsuls are going through lotteries every year, so there's some different velocities there. Tiberius basically says the Senate will do its lottery thing, but if I like the guy Saturninus in Germany, he can stay there for 12 years. Pontius Pilatus, he can stay there for 7 years. I don't care if these people are doing a good enough job. And it's just very interesting. Once you've established that there are loyal people, why rock the boat?
Yeah. But then you get that weird thing with on top of that, it's like, but then there's you've got to have been a praetor urbanus. Then you can be a consul 2 years later. You can't be a consul before that. You can only have proconsulship certain years. So I think the Asian and African proconsulships, the pattern is you have to have been consul 13 years before. And you can pretty much assign all of the proconsuls of those two provinces especially.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if you have somebody who has a decent record system, that means that you know pretty well who might be your candidate, and then you can just, if you're Vespasian, you can go, don't like him, he is with Vitellius, okay, must be that guy.
Yeah, but it's not just loyalties, and I think there's that really interesting with for instance with Agricola's double proconsulship of Britain, that it's exceptional, and at the same time it's not exceptional, because it comes back to what Lindsay was just saying about Tiberius. Well, I like him there, keep him there. And then you get the others where you've got to scramble because in the Domitian's Dacian Wars, you've got Fonteius Agrippa, and the Praetorian Guard prefect. They're both killed in office. You're like, whoa, who are we replacing them with? So there must be huge lists somewhere, which unfortunately are not written down and don't survive, of all the people that they would put in if X, Y, Z happens.
In the case of Tiberius, later in his reign, it was around about sort of 33, 35, something like that, he bitterly complains to the Senate to say that people are not coming forward and proposing themselves that they will take on governorships and military positions. It's not acceptable. And at one point, it gets so bad that he has to actually take people who've just finished as quaestors in different, and he has to send them back and say, you have to do another 2 years because I haven't got people, folks. And the other interesting issue is that the quality of the soldiers is diminishing, because it's always the poor and down and outs who need the money, need a career. They will volunteer to go into the army, and they're not necessarily the best physical specimens. And he's furious about that. So he threatens to have conscription as well. And what it points to me, going back to the subject which we're talking about, legions, is part of the reason I think when you look under Augustus, he had 28, which went down to 25 legions, obviously post 9 AD, is it was such an effort to keep that machinery going, to replace them, and actually to even expand their number. And you look at, for example, the accusations that Tacitus makes of Tiberius basically as being someone who wasn't terribly interested in adding to the glory of Rome. No, just the keeping the thing itself, a valid and working was enough of a challenge without doing other things. So when you think then going forward to the recruitment of new legions under Claudius and under Trajan, what an amazing achievement that must have been.
It's also fascinating when you lose legions, how they're not immediately replaced, and they're not even immediately like, we'll take the veterans and we'll put them in a new legion. And, even if
perhaps,
it's not the same legion.
Except after the year of the four emperors, it seems to be pretty quick.
No, so you get the loss of 2 legions under Domitian, and they're not replaced until Trajan.
Yeah, but I mean, just right on, because, what is it? The 5th disappears in the Batavian Revolt, and it pretty much, I think that's pretty much immediately replaced, or not?
No. So you get your Domitian founds one Minervia in 82, and then you have 21 Rapax disappears at some point, and we're not sure when. No, not Rapax, Primigenia. And so it's when did those two actually disappear? So we get these, disasters, and then we get, well, hang on, you lose a legion there, you lose a legion there, you lose a legion there. Which one? Which one did we lose? Because we can't track all of them. So we think that there's one lost in 86 and there's another one lost in 92. But those two, we're not sure which one it is, and they're not really replaced until Trajan brings in two new legions, the 2nd and the 30th. Yeah, that kind of like, why did you wait 15 years to bring in a new legion when you've lost one? So that machinery and that balancing is such a huge part of it.
Well, it's got to be ultimately. You're talking about very practically minded people. They have made a calculation that they don't seem to think that there is the urgency to do it. There's a financial cost to actually doing the replacement as well. So you have to factor in a number of things there. And then when the need changes, the circumstance, then they recruit the people.
Of course, and they had founded new legions in the year of the 4 emperors. I mean, Nero had founded Prima Italica first, and then 7 Galbiana, and then 2 Adjutrix legions. So they were up quite a bit already. So maybe they didn't need replacing immediately.
Good old one Macrina never gets remembered. Poor old one Macrina.
Yeah, but it immediately disappears as well.
Yeah. But you have presumably you have 5,000 veterans. They might not have been very good veterans, wandering around going, "Well, where's my job?" These experienced, and the same with the 2 fleets. That you've got the Ravanic fleet and the Mycenum fleet being made into legions in 68 and 69.
Well, you have troops of those fleets being made into soldiers, and we go 6,000, 5,000, 6,000, but we don't know. It was kind of a chaotic situation.
Presumably, when you found a legion, you found it at full strength, rather than, I've got 1,000 guys. It's a legion. Like, well, we're a bit weak, but that may be the case too. Who knows?
I mean, you've got to remember what is the ultimate funding source of these things. And I think it's like a 1% tax on something like the sale of slaves or something. There's a 5% tax, and it all goes into the aerarium, right? And they've got to balance the books. So unless they're going off a campaign and they bring back a lot of spoil to be able to mint coinage to pay for all of this, there's always this financial constraint. And it does seem to me the result of that is, given the population and the ability, the bandwidth of the system to produce the wealth, they can never really seem to get more than about 30 legions consistently because they ain't the cash.
Coming back to what Lindsay said earlier, there's also, as you said, the manpower in terms of not the melees as such, but in terms of the leadership. I go back to Augustus. Augustus brings about such huge radical changes of saying, right, from this point on, we're going to restrict the people who can be commanding armies. I'm going to keep it to the friends and family grouping. I'm going to take out the prospect of anybody having a triumph who's not part of my inner circle, etc. And of course, that sort of changes the whole mentality of the upper classes of what had been the Roman Republic, where it had still been a relatively small group, but you'd had that competition between the ruling families of the Republic, saying, we want the great positions, we want the honor of triumphs, that's what we're competing for. And then when the game changes under Augustus, you've got a whole different mentality of, do we really need to actually be involved in this? What's the benefit of it? But then you've already mentioned also the year of the 4 emperors, where again that aristocracy changes again in terms of what's the population of it, what's the mentality, what's their end goal as such. So I think those changes in terms of the classes that you're going to be drawing upon in order to get your legates, to get your centurions later on, that's going to impact also how many legions you can have running around, because what can you draw upon in terms of your leadership manpower?
Well, that's where you get those exceptional, and they're not as well documented as we'd like. So ex-quaestor legati, that there are several examples of them, that they haven't yet been praetors, which is normally what we think in the cursus honorum, that once you've been a praetor, you can be a legatus of a legion. But we do have ex-quaestor legati. We have people who hold 2 quaestorships. So clearly there's...
well, they would be good at balancing the books, at least.
Yeah. But I think there's we like to think of things as this is the system. And it's like, yeah, but there's always exceptions within that system, whether it's Tiberius going, well, I'll keep you there, whether it's, who is it that has the legatus of the legion for 10 years? Oh, is it Trajan? There's all of those sorts of anomalies within the system that make you think, well, actually, it's not as systematic as we like to make it. It's much more anomalous than it is systematic.
And to Mark's point earlier, I think that as a direct consequence of having a standing professional army, trying to reconcile that with a political system, which is about having people moving up through the career paths with these breaks in, so many years of this and so many years of that. And then you kind of tinker with it. You'll say, oh, well, my sons have done great things, so we'll put them in 5 years ahead because, whatever the thing, Caius Lucas, the Julians, for example. It is complicated,
And of course, they could make a mistake somewhere along the line and be sidelined for a very long time.
And then you get Corbulo, and he will just fix it all. Well, I think we've just filled our time. We didn't talk about Fretensis very much in the last half hour or so, but that's nothing out of the ordinary.
But people can buy the issue.
Yeah, the issue covers most of that
That's
stuff.
what it's
We covered
for.
the early years.
Well, thank you for this interesting discussion. I'll see you again soon. Bye.